Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay, great. So today I want to talk to you about a project that looks at the role of goals and how they relate to rewards. And I want to, in case we don't get to the end, I want to acknowledge the people who've worked with me on this. So the first author is Sam. He used to be my postdoc and he just started his own lab at Yale. Professor Sonia Bishop and Ian Beller, who's a postdoc in Mark Disposito's lab, have helped us a lot with fMRI, part of this talk. And then Beth I won't show you too much about Beth's work, but Beth has essentially replicated all the behavioral and modeling results that I'll present, and done more on the modeling side, and is taking this product into EEG now. Okay, so I want you guys to think a little bit about what we call goal-directed choices. And the way psychologists think about it is by saying, like, okay, let's imagine you have, you're given a goal, or you set yourself a goal. For example, something like this. You might, remember some of your first programming classes, and more likely as not, you got an assignment that was write a program that prints hello world in whatever language you were studying at the time. Okay, that's your goal, to getting a program to print hello world. So how do psychologists think we do this? Well, they think we take this new goal and then we have some kind of model of the world that we might have in memory or accessible to us, and so that we're going to use this model of our world to try to plan a sequence of actions that might lead us to this goal. And then if whether it leads us to the goal or not, we can observe the outcomes of our choices and probably update this transition model of the world that we have. So we can take those outcomes and use them to learn more about the world, and then we can use that next time we have the same goal. Okay. But if we think about it, if you take AI or reinforcement learning models, we would code a new goal as a reward. As part of the reward function, we would just change the reward function to represent that new goal. And then we would do something like model-based planning, integrating this reward into trying to compute the future expected value. Okay, so we would take a goal immediately and translate it into a reward. And we could use our outcomes to learn transitions, but we could also use this reward function as a reward, as a reinforcer. And so we could also update a model-free value at the same time. Okay, and so this is in one slide. What this talk is about it's about saying, okay, when we reach a goal, is this just going to be something that's part of our goal-directed decision-making system, or is it also going to be interpreted as a reward that will be used to reinforce choices into cached values? Okay, so the idea from that came for this project came from the idea that when we think about rewards and reinforcers, we tend to think about primary reinforcers like chocolate. No one needs to be taught that chocolate is good. It's already there, and if you give chocolate to a toddler and they eat it, they'll want to eat it again, right? So it has this reinforcing property. So that's primary reinforcers. The secondary reinforcers too, that are more abstract things that we have to learn, have value, but then they carry this value very strongly. We've experienced it enough that you can think of this as a reward the same way you would chocolate. And there's various versions of this. So this is something that if you were naive would look like a very weird and abstract visual stimulus, but in our experiments we use signs like this to win or you lose, right? And I'm putting them up to show that perceptually there's nothing really different about them. It's really something that's been acquired. Okay, so we think of value-based decision-making as as a way to try to obtain this kind of outcomes, obtain this kind of outcomes that are reinforcers, that reinforce previous choices. And there's a host of literature that says we have a reward network in the brain, and it answers to this kind of primary or secondary rewards the same way, right? If you take the striatum, you give someone sugar or money or green circle, something that's often used as a reinforcer, and you'll get the same kind of signals in the striatum. I don't need to explain this in this lab. Okay. By contrast to this value-based decision making, we often think as a different kind of decision making, that's goal-directed decision making. Where we use instead outcomes to build a model of transitions and use them for planning. And I gave the example of Hello World, but you could take something super abstract like this. You could take an empty Sudoku grid and tell people their goal is this really complex way of rearranging numbers to respect some rule or criterion, and that's your goal. Okay. And the idea is that even though an AI might decide to set a reward function at this goal, as humans, we don't know if that's the case, right? Like this is just a completely random and new pattern that you see, and why would we treat it as a reward? Okay, but that's the feeling we have, is that when we reach a goal, it feels rewarding. It feels it feels like we give ourselves a reward when we do that. Okay, and so the question we're trying to ask ourselves is this actually a non-standard reinforcer, something that the brain interprets as a reward the same way it does more primary reinforcers? We think that's an important question because we actually don't get primary or secondary rewards that often when we learn in real life. Instead, we engage in a lot of goal-directed choices with non-previously experienced goals, so that we haven't had a chance to learn value about them, like those assignments or many others. And whether those goals are externally or internally driven, that's much more frequent than actually getting rewards. Okay, so we want to know if when we reach those goals, and we might be leveraging this reward system in a different way for those goals. I also think it's important for hierarchical decision making, because we often reach before we reach a familiar reward, like getting coffee or something like that, we have to go through multiple sub-goals that are not in themselves reinforcers. But there's a number of literature showing that they do seem to be reinforcing in some case in the options framework.
And could I ask a quick question, just
Yeah.
clarification?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's terminology or
Yeah.
So I think it's debatable whether like achieving a goal that you want to achieve in solving a task like Sudoku. To me, it seems like you could say that's a secondary reinforcer in the sense that, and maybe this is where you're going, so just tell me to shut up if it is, but um, the general sense that you're like competent at tasks is going to be predictive of reward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Predictive of you getting money and predictive of you getting primary rewards. And so you
Mm-hmm.
have to learn some kind of abstract thing that says I can perform tasks and I'm competent,
Mm-hmm.
but that sort of internal cue about that sensation could be, or that feeling could be itself like a secondary conditioner.
I see. So you would see that as something like even more abstract essentially than reaching the goal. Like you would say that when you reach the goal, you're getting a different signal that's I'm competent or something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess you have to have a way of having a flexible um, change in the goal. But then once you have some pattern in, let's say, a goal part of your brain,
Mm-hmm.
then the difference from, the KL divergence between that goal, that pattern, and where you
Mm-hmm.
are, or whatever distance metric you want to use, could be itself an indicator. It's just like the difference in that layer, regardless of what the actual pattern is, regardless of what the goal is, could be an indicator of your competence that itself has some value across any set of goals.
Yeah, potentially. I agree. Potentially, I think we're trying to get at something more specific here. But I think you're right. That could be part of the story.
Okay.
Okay. Can we go back to that at the end, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so we thought this was likely for a number of reasons. Some of them just that it makes sense, and it would be super useful for the brain to leverage this reward system in the context of using goals. There's also quite a bit of evidence in the brain um, that signals in areas that we call the brain's reward system respond to all kind of signals that don't look like what we define as primarily as reward. So people have, either measured dopamine neurons um, or bold signals in the striatum, and show that they're sensitive to all kind of factors like pseudo rewards or model-based influence on reward prediction errors, information novelty, and I could cite many more. And sorry for not actually citing the papers. And so there's a number of there's many reasons to think that essentially this value computation that we're doing is not purely limited to things like rewards. And so we're trying to get at this general idea that some of or many of those could be explained by actually it might be a goal to obtain information, or it might be a goal to explore, and because of that obtaining novelty or information might look like a reward because it's like reaching a goal. Okay, so that's the general theory behind this. Okay, so the questions I'll try to ask are, we're going to try to show evidence for the fact that we assign reward value to attaining arbitrary goals, and to control well, we're going to do instructed goals rather than self-selected goals. And then we'll ask if reaching an instructed goal not just feels rewarding, but also reinforces past choices in the sense of more free reinforcement learning, and so drives canonical reward signals in the brain. And we'll try to understand the role of working memory in setting this reward function. Okay, so we're taking the framework of reinforcement learning. So of course, I don't really need to explain here, but I'll just set up my little sketch because it will be helpful later. So in reinforcement learning, we're thinking of states, or stimuli in our case, and we have an algorithm that selects an action after which we get a reward. And this reward updates the for example, values that our algorithm is using, and the action can also trigger a next stimulus. So we'll be tracking the value of a stimulus and an action, reward prediction errors, and we'll be using just those classic equations. And I'm really going through this quickly because I don't think I need to do that, but if I do need to walk through it, let me know. Okay, the key question really is, how do we set this reward value here? What counts as a reward, and how do we set it, and how does the brain set it in a given context? Okay, and the key hypothesis is that even when action and outcomes are simply the realization of an instructed goal, the brain's instrumental reward learning network will be recorded as if it was an instructed reinforcer, and that working memory plays a crucial role in setting this reward function, and maybe talking to the reward parts of the brain for setting this reward function. Okay, are you guys with me? I'm going to jump to the experimental protocol after.
And can I ask a question? Can I ask
Yeah.
a question here?
Yeah.
We've kind of set this up with like reward primary reinforcers being kind of primacy and goals being an example of primary reinforcers, but is some of the stuff you're going to say kind of going to be consistent with the opposite, that maybe we don't think there's primary reinforcers, but there's only goals? Like even the child, if they have a tummy ache, isn't going to want the chocolate.
I will also keep this for the discussion, but I think that's a very fair point. I think, for example, Melissa Sharp, I think, would take all my study and turn it around and say, this is all evidence that instead of everything being model free, everything is model based, or something like that. And I think there's going to be some point at which it will be very hard to decide which of the two it is. It's going to be more words than context. So as long as we predict the same thing, I think it's going to be okay. But that's a fair point. Yeah, and probably better addressed at the end too. Okay, experiments. So some things are going to look familiar at first because we're taking the probabilistic selection task approach to this question, and we're setting up a baseline with the classic version of it, except we're putting the screen at the beginning. So this is what participants would see at the beginning of the trial. They would see win +1, lose +0. Then they would choose between two bandits here, triangle and circle, or just two choices, and get rewarded here. Okay, so the triangle got a +1. Next trial, they pick the triangle again, +1. Next trial, different pair of bandits. They pick the cross, they get a +1. Next trial, triangle, +0. Okay, probabilistic selection task with two pairs of bandits. I don't think you guys know what I'm talking about at all. Uh, okay, instructions are that in those point trials, you can win 1 point or 0 points, and you should try to learn which symbols lead to points more often. Okay, interspersed with this, we have goal trials. In the goal trials, participants won't get points. Okay, so here's what a goal trial looks like. At the beginning of the trial, you'll see two fractals, one under goal and one under non-goal. Okay, so memorize, pretend you're a participant. Okay, you see a new pair of bandits. We select the diamonds, and here's our outcome. Was this our goal or not? Yes. Okay, so the diamond led to the goal. Next trial, completely new pair of fractals. Okay, you never see a fractal more than once. So you have to do this one-shot attribution of goal versus non-goal label to this abstract symbol here. Okay, so we pick the diamond. We get this goal, not goal. Goal. Okay, great. So we're picking, we're getting to the next trial. The last two times we picked the diamond, gave us our goal. We're going to pick the diamond again, and this time this is not our goal. Okay, you might have forgotten. So you see immediately that it's harder, right? It's harder. You actually have to encode this. You have to like actively decide what is reinforcing or not. Okay, so that's the gist of the task. A trial, there's a pre-choice period where you see which condition you're going to be in. Then you pick a choice between the bandits. Then you get your feedback. This is what we're going to call the familiar reward condition. This is the instructed reward condition where you're shown goals versus no goals. Everything is interleaved and yoked. There's 4 pairs of bandits, but one pair of bandits is always either in the goal or in the reward condition. Okay. We have difficulty manipulation, a 90-10 easy condition, and a 77-23 hard condition for both pairs of trials. We have also we repeat the task twice. So in one run there's shapes, and in the other run there's colors. Of course, controlled, counterbalanced between subjects. Okay, and we do have a testing phase that follows each learning phases. Again, you guys know all about this. We're just recombining them. The bandits together with no feedback as a way to test what's retained at the end of the experiment. All good with experimental design? And the timing of the task is a bit slow because it's an fMRI experiment, so it's jittered.
So I do have a question about the design. So and I think you sort of alluded to that you might be going here, but there's a difficulty manipulation in terms of goals versus rewards, just because there are many goals and it's more working memory demanding.
Yeah.
So, like in normally when you have a goal, until you've accomplished it, it's just held in mind in more of like a blocked way rather than interleaved between many different goals in a flexible thing. Yeah. So is that going to be an issue if you see a difference, or is not really?
So we think we have a good control for this. So I think a way to rephrase what you're saying is that we have a little bit of a dual task situation here. Sorry, let me go here. Right, you have a little bit of a dual task situation because you have to hold this in mind while you're making the choice. Is that what you're saying, Michael?
You have to hold the goal in mind, but you also have to do that. You have to switch between different goals in mind on
Yeah,
every trial,
yeah,
whereas,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah, yeah. So it's completely undeniable that this condition is harder than this one due to task experiments that could be independent of the actual processing of the goal here. That's what you're
yeah,
saying, right, Michael?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So absolutely, and that's right. And I think I have a satisfactory answer for
Okay.
that in the results. But again, let me know if you're not satisfied with it. Okay, let's foreshadow a little bit is that if there's a difficulty confound, there's a number of predictions you should make, for example, in terms of reaction times, in terms of how it's related to working memory and stuff like that. And also, you should be able to try to difficulty match in terms of performance and then see what remains out of that. And all of the results essentially hold when you do this checks. Okay, we have an independent working memory measure. We tried to pick a task that had a bit of this dynamic, updating of working memory set up for that. So it's an NBAC, very super classic with abstract shapes. So it's really hard. And of one is easy, and of two is getting a bit difficult, and of three is really hard. And we have a participant who was perfect at N of 3, and I couldn't believe it. Anyway, okay, results. So how does the behavior look like? Let's just first look at the proportion of correct choices. And by correct, I mean optimal as defined by the experimenter. So pick the bandit that is officially the best one on aggregate in the familiar or instructed condition. So what you see pretty clearly here is that there's a main effect of difficulty as explicitly manipulated in the probability of the outcomes. So easy and hard here refers to the 90 versus 75% probability. And there's a main effect of condition. Participants are worse in the instructed compared to familiar condition. So that's what we would all have expected, given that the instructed condition is harder. Those are learning curves with bin trials. And something that you can see already is that we have a really nice natural control here, because the hard familiar versus easy instructed conditions are exactly at the same level of performance. So that helps us tease apart a little bit this potential difficulty confound. Okay, so the next thing we checked was reaction times in those four conditions. And there's two important things there for reaction times. One is that if the instructed condition with goals elicits a more goal-directed kind of behavior versus the familiar condition, a more instrumental kind of behavior, you should predict slower reaction times in the instructed condition. And also, if there's a dual task difficulty kind of confound, you should also predict slower reaction times in the instructed condition. Instead, we find a main effect of the probabilities, so the difficulty level here in the reaction times, but no main effect and no interaction with the actual condition. Okay, so participants are just as fast at making their choices in the instructed versus familiar condition, which to us is the first way of ruling out that participants are making choices in a completely different way in this context. They seem instead to be relying, as far as we can tell from reaction times, on similar cognitive processes. Okay, next we looked at the role of working memory. So to do that, we just did across participants, we looked at their and back performance here, the D prime. and try to predict the performance in the easy versus hard condition as a function of their performance. Okay, so we have no relationship between n back d prime and performance in the familiar condition. That's the gray dots here, and we have a strong relationship between working memory performance and the instructed condition. So here again, we had a worry about difficulty and also potential ceiling effect in the familiar condition. So to avoid that, we compare also the dark gray and the light blue that shouldn't have differences in ceiling effect and should be at about the same level of performance. And we have again the significant effect only in the instructed condition and not in the hard condition. Does that make sense? Okay, so it seems like this shows that working memory has a selective contribution to learning from those instructed goals versus the familiar rewards when we're controlling for difficulty.
So I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in the previous slide, the reaction time, you had said that helped to be kind of a first rule out that these were, I think, qualitatively distinct strategies that they were using in the two conditions. But then if you think also that based on the correlation with the MBAC, that there's like uniquely working memory serving a role here, how do you kind of reconcile those two?
Yeah, so what I'm saying here is that the choice process is similar. And what I'm saying here is that probably working memory contributes to the learning process, not to the choice process. So what I'm going to get to is that what I think is happening is that in both cases, you're learning a cached, model-free RL value that you're using to make the choice, similarly in both cases, but that to do this update here in the instructed condition, you need working memory to set up the reward function.
Thanks.
Okay, and just for full disclosure, there's pretty good test-retest reliability in this task. So this is performance run 1 versus run 2. You see it's correlated. There's definitely meta-learning. Participants are better in the instructed reward the second time they do it around. They're also better in the familiar reward, but it's more striking, I think, in the instructed reward condition. Okay, next we analyzed the testing phase results. And here we had everything paired with everything, so it's always a little bit hard to visualize any results. So instead, I'll show you, I'll give you the results of the logistic regression analysis. So we tried to predict whether participants would pick the left or the right bandit as a function of a number of predictors, including the condition, the number of past successful outcomes, so that would be reward in the instructed case and goals in the non-instructed case, and interaction factors and condition difference. And what we find is that there is a bias for selecting an item that will learn in the familiar reward condition versus instructed reward condition. And sorry, the sun is rising. So there is a small bias here. There is a strong effect of number of past successful outcomes, and there's no interaction between this and condition. Okay, so the takeoff way of that is that the effect of experiencing either a reward or a goal is similar in both conditions, though there is an overall small bias.
Is the bias that you see for the familiar condition, do you interpret that the same way as in RLWM, where people prefer low set sizes over high set sizes because of sort of effort that was involved?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah, that's the best explanation we have for it. Sorry, maybe I should go. Actually, give me 2 seconds. I'll go close that curtain. Sorry about that.
Can I add to can I add to Michael's question? Do you think that do you think you would be able to disentangle that effort explanation from one where, because there's slower learning in the case of the familiar, or sorry, in case of the instructed task, that you might have less certainty and therefore kind of a blunted reward prediction error as compared with the familiar?
I think any effect that's directly related to the rewards are going to should have shown up in an interaction between reward and condition, and we don't have that. So this feels more like something global than specific. But I don't have a better answer than that, unfortunately. We're not completely sure. In an ideal world, we would have had no bias. That wasn't part of our prediction, but it's also not absurd to to obtain this in this case.
One more.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So they only know that they only know how many rewards they got if they successfully remembered the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So isn't it possible that it's all a reward effect? They just don't, they misattributed some trials in the instructed task because they forgot, or
would that lead to a familiar bias?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is maybe they actually thought that their performance was lower in the instructed case than it actually was.
I see.
I think that would lead to the interaction that Anne was saying. That
yeah, I think it will lead to the interaction, and I think participants, you see that they learn, right? So. And if you think about it, it's hard, but it's really just a one back, right? It's really like you just have one thing to remember. So it shouldn't be beyond anyone's memory capacity. So I don't think that's the introspection of people in this task. I think people think they're doing fine. But I agree with Michael. I think that would lead to the interaction rather than an overall bias. Yeah. Okay, so
and can I also have a
yeah,
question?
go ahead.
Maybe it's also going to lead to the interaction. I'm not sure, but another difference between them is that the feedback is the same throughout the whole trial. So it's always +1.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the instruction, it's always different, and I need to remember which one. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not only that I need to rely on memory to do that. I also need to rely on a different memory information on each trial in order to have the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And that in itself, the fact, so I don't know, maybe the rewarding aspect is just much more rewarding accumulatively in the non-instructed, in the familiar version, because +1 is just something I'm really familiar with. I already have
Yeah, but again, this explanation should go into an interaction, right? Because it would be cumulative.
Okay.
Right, because essentially you're saying, a reward would be worth 1.5 and a goal would be worth 1. And if that was the case, you just should have a stronger effect of reward in the familiar condition than you would in the instructed condition, and that should show up as an interaction.
Okay, so I guess I'm not understanding completely the results that we do have now. So maybe can you then explain again this figure again?
Yeah, sorry, it's hard to visualize. So, and we essentially what I should have done is plot this per condition. This effect of the number of outcomes you've had is the same in the instructed condition as it is in the reward condition. So said otherwise, if you have had the same number of rewards, if you imagine a participant who performed the same way during the learning phase in instructed and non-instructed, and we do have a few of those, then what this is saying is that they would be equally good at differentiating between the 90 and the 77% in the instructed condition and in the goal condition. They would be equally good. But if you give them the 90% in the reward condition and the 90% in the goal condition jointly, they'll be slightly more likely to pick the 90% in the reward condition. So that's the bias. The absence of interaction means that they're as good at picking within their conditions, conditioned on their past reward history. Does that make sense? And any explanation that tries to get, any explanation about how, for example, a goal like might feel less rewarding than a point would show up in an interaction because it would be cumulative, right? The value difference would end up being smaller because the scale of the reward would be smaller, and so that would make you a bit less good. Make sense, Rachel?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we're doing something very novel for computational modeling. We're just learning the value of each bandit with classic delta row kind of reward. Learning rate, reward prediction. I'm not getting into details. We are including decay and sticky choice parameters into this model. And then we test how the parameters depend on condition. So Sam chose to use HBI. I don't know how familiar you guys are with it. That's the joint, semi-hierarchical plus exceedance probability kind of framework. And when we do that, what we get is a very clear winner. That's a model in which we have two learning rates, so one learning rate per condition. So one learning rate for instructed and one learning rate for familiar rewards. It captures the learning curve decently well, and it does so by having slightly lower learning rate in the instructed condition compared to the familiar condition.
And I just a quick technical question here.
Yeah.
Was the goal to use HBI just in case there was different groups of subjects? Because when you have exceedance probability of one, then it just ends up being regular.
I agree. In case there were differences, and as a way to try out HBI. Okay. It's kind of silly reason to do it. Also, Sam hasn't used Stan before, so that was kind of a simple version of having a group level regularization in the data. Okay, one important model we included in the model comparison here is a model with two noise parameters, one per condition, that didn't work, and we think that's important because essentially it shows that they're worse not just because the behavior is noisier, which would again be a prediction of a dual task kind of model, saying like, okay, well, the performance in the instructed condition is worse just because you're making noisier choices. That doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, so it seems instead that it's slower learning, and we're certainly not seeing this as a mechanistic explanation. We don't think, we don't necessarily think it's actually a slower learning rate. We think that rather what this slower learning rate is capturing is lapses in memory. It's saying like occasionally you won't hold the goal in mind well, or even, either you won't remember what the outcome is and so not update, or you will remember the wrong way and update in the wrong direction or something like that. And the learning rate being lower is going to capture and aggregate these lapses in the instructed reward condition. Does that make sense? Okay, so interim summary, participants seem to be able to learn instrumental values using instructed goals with a choice process that seems to be similar to more classic reinforcement learning. And because of that, it seems like obtaining an instructed goal has a reinforcing effect. Those task-based choices look really like the reward ones. And that working memory plays a role in setting this reward function for this completely new instructed goal, as seen by individual differences here. Okay. Before I guess we have until 12:30 or 1?
I think we should have until 1, right, Sita?
Oh yeah, we do.
Okay, so I'm not in a rush. Is that right?
Nope.
Right.
Okay,
You're, like yeah, you're right. As in like you're not in a rush.
Okay. Okay, so let me show you quickly the replication of those behavioral results. And there's very slight differences, but they're fairly minor. So Beth runs this experiment in EEG, exactly the same. Actually, we kept the same temporal sequences, so everything is the same. The behavior, the one thing that looks behavior is that we have a much weaker effect of difficulty in the instructed condition than we did before. So here there's a bit of an interaction between difficulty and condition, and we're not sure why. You see it really well here also in the learning curves. They're more on top of each other. No, we don't know. We don't know why it's different. But otherwise, we also get both main effects. Beth comes from a mathematical psychology background, and she was very interested in getting at individual differences. So she took a more careful look at individual participants here and showed that really the effect of condition is very reliably present, but there is still fairly big individual differences. You can see here, for example, one participant who's doing better in the instructed than familiar condition. You can see some participants are doing amazingly well in the task 2, and some participants who have the more expected, difficulty in the instructed versus familiar. So what Beth wanted to do is she wanted to do joint modeling of the two of the task rather than using the n-back task as external correlate. She tried to model performance in the n-back task and in the learning task jointly. So she used the hierarchical multi-model reinforcement learning framework for that. There's a reinforcement learning model, and then she has a model for working memory too, and that's just a signal detection theory model where she tries to estimate for each participant, and then at the group level to discriminability and bias in the n-back task. And then rather than treating them independently, she puts them all in a single big model and tries to have individual participants' discriminability, see how that influences the parameters in the reinforcement learning model. Okay, she also had separate positive and negative learning rate in this model. Okay, so the way she did that is by doing regression inside the model. So she takes the forgetting parameters and sets up a linkage function between the working memory model and the reinforcement learning model, where the discriminability in the signal detection theory model for the n-back task directly influences forgetting in the instructed and in the familiar condition, and also influences the difference in learning rate between the familiar and instructed condition. And she's tried a number of versions of this model, and this one is the one that captures the data best. So the model recapitulates the behavior. Again, we have a little bit of this jump at the beginning that we can't quite capture. And when you do that, you can then look at the more directly at the effect of working memory on those parameters in a fully hierarchical way. And she finds the same, that Sam did essentially in a quite different technical setup, but the results, kind of give it external validation, just taking a completely different approach and getting very similar results. So she finds that the D prime of working memory predicts instructed condition for getting, but not familiar condition for getting. And also that it also predicts the difference in the learning rate, same as Sam observed in the fMRI data. Okay, so it seems like so she's able to do this joint modeling and then actually get at the specific influence of working memory on both this forgetting that might reflect an actual contribution of working memory to the learning process in both cases, but also this difference in the positive learning rate as Sam had.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense and is intuitive, but I would also have a priori, I wouldn't really know what to predict, whether it would be the difference, basically based on some work by Ann Collins on how regular learning is driven by working memory. So you would think from that maybe the degree to which people use working memory, even in the standard RL task, might also relate to working memory and not just the difference. Is it just because it's that much more taxing on working memory or something?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, you're right. We've shown evidence that there is working memory effects in probabilistic reinforcement learning tasks too. So I don't know if we're seeing it more. So I think what you're saying is that we should see it a little bit here too, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's effectively a low set size. So maybe that's the thing, is if you had higher set size, you would see it.
Yeah, potentially. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's...
I had a question along those lines too. I was wondering if there's any way to kind of get at that idea that if you're using working memory during the learning phase, that you might that might lead to lower RPs to the RL system that then shows up as weaker learning at test. And I guess in particular with the first study, results that there was worse performance for the test that we think has higher working memory demands. I think Michael had asked if that was due to this sort of the effort associated with it, but I was wondering if that could also be due to the lower RPEs, that I guess that idea that the key value is a joint contribution of the working memory and RL, and you get less RL based learning.
Yeah, so I think it's unlikely for the same reason as before, that it should show up as an interaction rather than a main effect. And also because it's much harder to know in the probabilistic case, right? When I showed those working memory influencing the Q value effect, that was in a deterministic task, and it was easy to know what the working memory would actually be holding in mind at feedback. But in a probabilistic task, it's much harder to know if it would be holding what it's predicting or it's expected, and exactly what effect that would have on the learning is not completely clear. That's something I've tried to get at in this probabilistic task, and it's been very, very hard to see. So that's the second reason, more theoretical and interesting, why I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Okay, thanks.
Can I have a question too? Did you ever try to see if, in a test phase kind of way, to see if they can remember the fractals themselves better? They can choose between the win or the lose?
That's a great question, and no, we did not, but we want to make that follow up because in an ideal world, I would have a way to know at each trial whether they remember the fractal or not, and I'm kind of I was hoping to get at that with a fMRI in a kind of decoding sense, or even with the EEG, and we have things that bring us a bit closer to that, but not to trial by trial degree.
No, I was even wondering if just the difficulty, if it's more probabilistic, if you would have less memory, or you less accuracy in choosing the goal than the non-goal. if it was presented in a difficult version than in the easy version.
I see. So you're envisioning a test, a memory phase where you show the goal images, and you're predicting that participants would be less likely to remember the goals for the difficult and easy.
Or maybe just the opposite. Yeah, I don't know, but maybe there will be a main effect there.
Yeah, I think there would be a number of effects. There would definitely be an effect of well, I think there would be an effect of label. You know, whether it was goal or not goal, I think participants would be much more likely to remember a goal than a non-goal fractal. There would be an effect of what they saw, what they actually got. Because that's just a repetition.
Yeah, but the familiarity with each of them is the same because they only see them once. So then it will be interesting if that. I guess then the interaction with
they see
difficulty.
them once or twice, right? Because they see it before the trial, and then they see one of them as the outcome.
Oh, yeah, that's
right.
True.
And so you'd have to control for that. No, it's a follow-up we really want to do, because I think that could potentially help us, go back and try to explain more trial by trial what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about your decay parameter of the model. So I guess maybe, and feel free to punt this, I wonder, you're mentioning that these effects might be due to decay of the working memory trace, which is feeding into the Q value. But I guess, do you in this model, or in general, do you discriminate theoretically between failure to encode versus forgetting? And is there a way to test that in the model?
First, in this framework, I don't really say that the working memory is feeding into the Q value. I'm really saying that the working memory, I mean, there might be a bit of that, as all my past work has shown, but that's not what we're trying to capture at all in this model. What I'm trying to say instead is that the working memory maintenance of the goal is going to feed into the reward function that is then going to be used to update the Q value. We can't distinguish between encoding and retrieval at all in this task. We can't even really get at either, right? Because we don't really ask for it. So we have only to see the cumulated effect across trials. And that's a reason why having this test phase might be interesting, because if they were able to remember it, at least we will have some evidence for encoding and retrieval later on. And if we had evidence for encoding, then a failure would be easier to attribute to a failed retrieval, something like
that. I see. Okay, so here the data and the task in the model can't really speak to, and it's kind of agnostic. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, so that's the behavioral modeling results. And the open questions that remains are whether this is really due to the brain, all those results are really due to the brain treating those goals as they would familiar rewards. And how working memory is playing this role that it seems to be playing across participants. Okay, so the framework that we're working with is this reinforcement learning setup. And again, you guys don't need this explanation. We think that there's something like that implemented in corticostriatal loops with dopaminergic signaling, reinforcing choices. And somehow those dopaminergic neurons are getting information of reward usually. And so really what we're asking is, okay, when you're getting a goal, when I'm instructing you about a goal, are you using your working memory to hold this goal in mind in such a way that it can pass that reward information down to the reward system, pass it down here so that it ends up being integrated as an instrumental value rather than being used purely in a goal-directed way. Okay, so that's what we're trying to test with the imaging. And the predictions it makes is that you should find the same encoding of instructed and familiar values, and that it should somehow be working memory dependent. And I'll emphasize also the alternative competing hypothesis, which is that you could get completely qualitatively different responses to instructed goals, and that you could use completely different networks for the two parts of this task. And that would be the more the hypothesis that would be more in line with the way we frame things usually, saying like, okay, you're trying to reach a goal, you're going to make goal-directed decision making, you use your executive network to do that, and once you obtain a goal, you're going to observe a state prediction error that will help you update your transition model. Okay, and there are a number of studies showing different kind of brain networks in this kind of setup. Okay, so non-trivial is what I'm trying to say here. Okay, so let's move on to the imaging, and I hope you guys won't ask me too hard technical questions there, because I definitely didn't set up all the cleaning and contrast and stuff like that. So you're welcome to ask all the questions, and I might tell you that I don't know and you should ask someone else. Sounds good? Okay, so we started by just doing some basic whole brain contrasts of the main conditions in the task, so familiar versus instructed. And I'm going to set up a few predictions here. First, we're going to look at various times in the trial too. So first, we predict that this instructed condition should recruit more visual processing at pre-choice. You're seeing those complex fractals versus numbers. So that's kind of a boring prediction, but it's kind of an important check. That the instructed condition should recruit the working memory network so that you can encode those fractals as goals, and that the familiar condition could recruit more valence network. And this could be for one of two reasons. One could be for the alternative competing hypothesis that actually the instructed condition does not recruit the reward network. It could also be under our hypothesis, you could have more recruitment of the familiar of the valence network because participants perform better overall. Okay, so they might be expecting to get more reward overall in this task. Okay, so we'll have to disentangle that. Okay, so remember, there's a pre-choice period. We jitter things so that we can look at a pre-choice period, at the choice period, and then at the outcome period. So in the pre-choice period, we get a bit of a valence network, striatum, ventromedial prefrontal cortex for familiar versus instructed condition, and we get strong visual cortex activation, but also parietal and lateral prefrontal. So this is working memory network here. And a bit of hippocampus, potentially more long-term encoding of those fractals. Okay, so that matches our predictions so far, and I'll get at the disentangling here a bit later.
Sorry, Anne, can I just ask real quick, is that lateral prefrontal FEF or human equivalent FEF? Like, is that maybe saccade?
I don't think so, but that's one of those questions that might be beyond me. So let me just take a note. We labeled it as DLPFC, so I assume it's not FEF, but yeah, sorry, I can't give you a better answer. I'll make sure to ask Sam. Okay, so then we looked at choice, and in the familiar condition, we had a little bit more ventromedial PFC than in the instructed condition. In the instructed condition, there remains some visual V1 and striatal activity here. So what's notable here is that there's no working memory network during the choice period. So it doesn't look like active maintenance, and that's something that has been observed in other working memory tasks, that you don't necessarily see it in the bold signal. Okay, and then at the feedback phase, again, we got slightly more striatal activation in the familiar condition compared to the instructed condition. To check what between those two possibilities for interpreting this, as I mentioned earlier, we just did across participants this beta weights in these regions versus learning performance, and it does seem to be related to how much better our participants are doing in familiar versus instructed conditions. So we are interpreting this as more expectation of reward in familiar versus instructed.
Wait, I thought this was the feedback signal, not the pre-choice signal.
Yeah, we have the same results in the pre-choice. Sorry, I didn't put the I didn't put it there.
Okay, but the interpretation for the feedback, shouldn't it just be that if you get more of a reward signal, you learn better? I mean, you could recast that result as saying those who are able to recruit this striatum in the instructed case have less of a deficit, which I think is consistent.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, and then the instructed condition recruits dorsolateral prefrontal cortex more again than the familiar. So that seems like the working memory potentially retrieval system at play as predicted. Okay, so it looks like the instructed condition recruits more strongly the working memory network at pre-choice and at feedback, but not at choice. And that the familiar condition overactivates some valence areas, and that this appears to be linked to better performance. So next, we wanted to go a bit more carefully into the RL network in the brain. So we designed some regions of interest that are related to reinforcement learning processing. So feedback locked, we looked at the effect of valence, so positive versus negative outcome in either condition, effect of coding of reward prediction errors. Stimulus locked Q values. And the prediction here again was that the reward network, as identified by the familiar condition, should also support all the signals in the instructed reward RL representations. Okay, so we're kind of predicting a null result, except we have a positive way to test it. So we are designing the regions of interest purely based on the familiar condition, and then we're testing whether we're seeing a significant signal in the instructed condition. Does that make sense? Okay, so we kind of did this double cross validation for the regions of interest, where we got the ROI with a live one out subject definition. So we test even the familiar condition, we leave out that participant for their own ROI, and then we test this on the instructed condition, so that there's just no double dipping possible in either cases. Okay, and this is also masked with a priori anatomical region. Okay, so here are some ROI examples. I'll just put them all out. So for Q value, we pulled out something like ventral medial prefrontal cortex. We found reward prediction error signals in OFC, striatum, and parietal cortex, and we found valence in ventral striatum and hippocampus. So valence is outcome, positive versus negative. And the RP is orthogonalized after valence, so it doesn't have the valence in it. Okay, so first let's look at valence in those two RIs. So this is the betas for the familiar condition, and again, this isn't double dipping because it's taking a single participant on the array of all other participants. So we get, but it is expected, we get those valence effects in the striatum and hippocampus, and we get the same valence effects in the instructed condition in those participants. Next, we looked at the choice Q values here at the time of choice, and found a strong effect in ventromedial prefrontal cortex that is also present in the instructed condition. And next, we looked at the continuous reward prediction error regressor, again controlled for valence. And we find it in 3 regions here in the OFC, parietal cortex, and striatum, all fairly expected regions. And when we do that for the instructed condition, we find significant results in OFC and parietal cortex, but not in striatum. So that's the one grain of salt in our results. So we try to dig a little bit deeper into this one. So this isn't significant, but it's also not significantly different from this. So, you know, it's not conclusive either way. So that's why we try to dig a little bit deeper into this one. So we try to do an encoding approach instead. So we try to train a regression model to predict the model reward prediction error in the familiar context based on the single trial voxel activity of those striatal network, the striatal ROI here. So we just train a regression to predict the RPE, and we do this, actually this formula is wrong, this is not multivariate, it's univariate. So we just train voxel per voxel across trials. And then we use those regression weights for each voxel to predict an instructed reward prediction error from the instructed trial voxel activity. So for each voxel, you can predict the RP from their activity based on the weights that you trained on the familiar reward prediction error. And we average across voxels. And so that's our average predicted reward prediction error in the instructed condition. And then we can just correlate this with a true reward prediction error as extracted from the model fitting. Does that make sense? I know it's a bit messy. And so that's an example. The predicted RPE here is predicted from the activity of the voxels in the striatum based on a model trained on the familiar condition, and this is the model derived reward prediction error. So we can get a correlation coefficient here, and we can see how good that correlation coefficient is across participants. And we can, yeah.
Just technically, you're actually including voxels that are not significantly related to RPE in that correlation? So you're not doing the mask thing first and then doing a dot product within the mask?
No, it is masked for the RI, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're training on a single run of the familiar condition, and then we're trying to predict on either the same run or the other run of the instructed condition, and also the other run of the familiar condition as a control, as a baseline. Okay, and so when we do that, the top two are the easiest ones in a sense. It's familiar across run and instructed within runs. And within runs, that could be, you know, any kind of temporal effects that could create confounds. So that's why we also wanted to do instructed across runs. And in all cases, the correlation coefficient is significantly greater than 0. Okay, so it seems like we can still capture some of the reward prediction are activity in the stratum in the instructed condition based on a model trained on the familiar condition. Okay, so there is shared information there. It's a bit of a roundabout way of going to it, but okay, so the interim conclusion here is that the reward network, as identified by the familiar condition, also seems to encode valenced RL variables in the instructed condition. So it seems to that this network is also storing cached values based on goals being treated as reinforcers.
And can I ask here? Sorry.
Yes.
RPs will be related to like predictions, outcomes, and updates. Can you be sure from an analysis like this you're not decoding one of those variables and it's actually RP, or
predictions, outcomes, and updates? Yeah. So the GLM includes you mean the latter, the last analysis, right? The one with the encoding? Yeah. So this is done only on positive outcomes to control for that. So we should really, essentially, we're getting at the expectation and potentially the update, but not the outcome.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah. And we didn't do it in the negative case because there's just fewer trials. Yeah. Okay, so trying to get now at the role of working memory in setting this reward function. So the prediction here is that the working memory network supports this reward processing activity. So maybe the prefrontal cortex primes the RL system to interpret the obtention of an instructed goal stimulus as rewarding. And so we're going to test this prediction with a functional correlation analysis, where we're predicting essentially that stronger encoding in working memory should lead to more reliable feedback signals in the reward network. Okay, so we're going to take regions of interest. So we're going to take this pre-choice lateral prefrontal cortex activity here, and we're going to mask it with NBAC, the working memory region identified by the NBAC mask. So this mask says which regions are more activated the higher N becomes in the NBAC task. Okay, so that's our way of identifying lateral prefrontal cortex of interest, region of interest here. Okay, so we're going to take this region of interest, and then we're going to take the activation in this region of interest and try to see if it predicts activation in the striatum at the time of feedback. Okay, so we're saying how strongly do you activate your prefrontal cortex during this instructed phase, and does this predict activation in reward regions at feedback? Does that make sense?
Is this only on rewarded trials also, or are you? Is this on everything?
It is only on rewarded trials, as written here. Yeah, yeah, as a way to again control for all this. Okay, so what we find here is what we predicted. So this connectivity index from prefrontal cortex to dorsal medial striatum is stronger in the instructed than familiar condition, and the difference here is marginally related to participants' NBAC performance. So to individual differences in NBAC performance and individual differences in condition differences in the learning task. We did the same thing for the hippocampus that was also sensitive to valence in this task. Sorry, I messed up my animations. And again, we have a stronger connectivity in the instructed than familiar condition. And it's again related to individual differences, significantly to NBAC and marginally to instructed versus familiar learning performance. Okay, we checked that it wasn't a confound for various signal-to-noise ratio effects by taking a control region, two control regions of interest, actually, nucleus accumbens and PCC, where we had no difference in this case. Okay, and the last more exploratory analysis we did was to, like we're kind of saying like, okay, working memory is going to talk somehow to maybe dopamine neurons as a way to feed this reward information into the reward system. So we designed a posteriori VTA region of analysis anatomically, and we tested the same connectivity analysis as before, and again found a stronger connectivity in the structured than familiar condition. There was no link to individual differences in performance in this case. So that wraps it up. So I think the takeaways we're trying to convince you of in this task is that learning from instructed reward or goals may rely on executive function and working memory in particular. And this learning appears to drive canonical reinforcement learning neural signatures, not a separate goal-directed network. And that top-down cortical input may prep the RL circuit to transform novel goals into standard rewards. Okay, and I'd like to thank again Sam, who ran this study, and Sonia and Ian, who were critical in setting up the fMRI. And this was originally funded by the Hellman Funds Fellowship, and also supported by NIH. And thank you all for your attention.